I know this is a post-lunch session, so we're going to have a pretty rousing session. I would say there's going to be some controversial discussions as we go into panel 2. So I'm going to be talking with this panel discussing about products to outcomes. Who pays and who gains? So for first panelist, I'd like to invite up all the panelists to stage. Dr. Wei Yang Cheong, Vice Provost, Singapore Management University, and Senior Advisor Health Economics from Ministry of Health, Singapore, please. He's played an integral role in numerous key health initiatives as deploying technology, development of policies, in especially the Healthier SG. And I think he really needs no introduction because we've seen his keynote address and a lot of his achievements. Next up, I'd like to invite Joachim Joerger-Ramos, Area Leader, APAC Digital Health Solutions, Customer Delivery, Abbott Labs. He's also the co-chair of APAC Med's Health Data Committee, where he champions interoperability in healthcare data systems. So I think that's going to be an interesting perspective as well. We now have one more person from the medtech industry, Priyantha de Silva, but he's given me liberty to call him Pri, so I'm going to take that. Pri, Associate Director, Digital Marketing, APAC, Boston Scientific, and he leads commercial marketing transformation programs that harness AI, data, and omnichannel engagement. Dr. Ronan Kelly, next up, Vice President Medical, Lilly and Company, leading the Lilly Center of Clinical Pharmacology in Singapore, and that now includes a special group focusing on digital health technologies. So that's an interesting perspective that we're going to tap into. And last but definitely not the least, and many of you know her here, Ying Yeoh, General Manager, Roche Pharmaceuticals, also the Vice President of SAPI, Singapore Association of Pharmaceutical Industries, and leads its Research and Development Committee as well. Welcome to all our esteemed panelists. All right, so I'm just going to set the stage a little bit. The first panel, heavy-duty AI, deep core tech stuff, and a lot of, I think, key words have been thrown around since the morning till now. There was a lot of value, a lot of outcome, who's going to pay, and I'm glad Ambuj said that earlier on, that, okay, eventually who's going to pay. This panel is going to be talking more about the business end of things. So they're going to be talking more about, how do we get these technologies, AI, new age development, all of this, but who's going to actually pay for them? And how does that work in our healthcare ecosystem? So the difficult job for this esteemed panel now is moving from selling products to outcomes. There's measurement required. Measurement is quite complex. It is possible with all the new age technologies, but we're going to debate two main questions. That's number one. Where are we in the value-based healthcare journey, not only Singapore, but over the region? That's one. What are the challenges so far, despite all the technology that we have? So we're going to do one round with that. The second round is going to be about looking at, okay, now that we have this technology, AI and everything that's come up between the last few years, from the last health ecosystem day to now, new stuff is coming in day in and day out. How can that actually bridge us forward to go and realize a little bit more about what value-based care brings to the promise of that to us? All right, so I'm just going to pull this forward a little bit. Okay, and so I'm going to start with Ying, actually. I wanted to ask you, we spoke earlier about in the preparation for this, and I think one of the questions that also came out is, we've tried this for some time, and there's been a lot of solutions that are out there, not just from pharma and medical devices, etc. But eventually, it's who's going to pay for it. And one of the previous panelists also did mention that. And I think first comes to, they were talking about value. So my first question to you, when we talk about outcome-based, value-based healthcare, it's not new. It's been there along. So who defines value? What defines value? And also, what have you seen that brings different stakeholders, from payers to startups in the ecosystem, etc., and pharma together to align on this value?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I must say, Jim, today the session has grown from where we were last year. So welcome, everybody. Yeah, the size have grown. I would say, during our discussion, we touched about this, right? I mean, Aparna was asking me about outcome-based agreement. And this, for those who have been in the industry for a while, is not a new concept. I think many have tried it. Many countries have also tried it. We have also tried from a pharma perspective, having agreements with countries, for example, where you cap certain payment and you guaranteed purchases, or you have tried based on milestones. Generally, it's number one, it's quite complex, something that hopefully with AI, etc., now you could actually simplify it. But I personally find that the fundamental challenge to any outcomes agreement is the agreement on the value itself. I think healthcare has evolved for a very long time, right? I've joined the industry as a oncology sales rep quite a while ago. And the outlook of oncology at that time are very different, right? Basically, what we are looking at is really survival. And it's about whether the drug really will be able to change a survival extension for patients. And fast forward to today, we have come a really long way. For those who still feels that cancer is a death sentence, I think you're stuck in a reality 50 years ago, right? It has changed so much. It's, yes, in some disease area more than the other, I can see Ronan rolling his eye. There's still way to go. But in a lot of key disease area, I think we have changed the landscape so much. But we have not changed our health technology assessment at all. We have not changed the value recognition of how do we actually look at treatment. And this is where I feel the biggest misalignment is to ensure there is any scalability and adaptability of new innovation into the system. And I look into just oncology, right? Like so many years later, we are still looking at OS and questioning whether PFS is a good proxy for OS. But we have moved to beyond, right? I see somebody laugh in the audience because it's a real question. And my question is that how do we redefine value and value for who? And I think that's the most important question that we at least needs to come to some basic element of alignment before we can actually move forward and say, let's be creative now. Because I do see value in outcome-based agreement. It's not just about acquisition, it's a lot about different things that we could now consider. But I think the fundamental thing is that can we at least align on what is the value recognition for new innovations that actually comes out in the market? Because we're not here in this society right now still looking at whether we survive or not. Quality of life is very important. In the era where, resources, hospital capacity and capability is becoming more expensive, those are elements that is important to also address. So how do we actually recognize all this to then agree on what kind of outcome do we actually want to put forth together on the table?
Right, absolutely. And just on that, I know I'm just diving back in a little bit. How does that, impact from a pharma company organization point of view, your investments towards, let's say, RWE trials and large-scale trials? How would that kind of impact or incentivize or detract even?
So I think we put a lot of emphasis in real-world data nowadays, knowing that phase 3 studies can only answer certain type of questions. And to be transparent to not all pharma is not going to do a direct head-to-head studies with every single molecule that is out there. So there is a real gap when it comes to clinical practice, right? Things that you can't answer beyond a phase 3 study. How do you use it in real life setting when you need to sequence it one over the other? How do you actually use it in different countries where your basic care and standard of care are very different? So real world evidence are very important. But recognition of real world evidence, I would say it's a growing field and not an immediately recognized evidence. I mean, if you just look at both in our health authority as well as our ACE submission recognition for real world evidence, it's something that falls into the bottom of kind of like nice to have. I would say there's a growing recognition because there is growing evidence. I hope that one day we will actually start to recognize those evidence more because it's the one that is most reflective of what is happening in the real world, right? And in Singapore, I think we are quite privileged. We sit on quite a lot of data. A lot of health system hospitals are really very good in capturing data, and we are moving into a centralized EMR system. I think that will really unlock a lot of capability to be able to really use those to create real-world evidence for us in this local ecosystem. And when that is available, I do hope that we will have policymakers, clinicians who will really adopt that to actually inform a real utility in our healthcare ecosystem.
Absolutely. And that's actually where I'd like to bring you in, Young. Is now, okay, as obviously as a payer, policy maker, I definitely want to get your point of view, and I'm sure the audience wants to hear that as well. So Singapore, we sit on a lot of data, and I think definitely in the region, I think Singapore is one of the kind of flagship or flag bearers for the rest of the market as well. So when it comes to bringing together all this data, looking at moving towards more value-based healthcare, but more specifically, let's say outcomes-based pricing or risk-sharing agreements. Two questions to you. One is that do you also agree that there is this alignment issue, or how much have you progressed, let's say, towards alignment, and where do you think is the hurdle still, if anything, to be crossed? And based on the available kind of progress that we have made, the data systems and policies that we have made, how do you see this going forward? Where do you see is value-based healthcare the next 3 to 5 years? How is it going to change in Singapore?
Yeah, I have to caveat, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Ministry of Health.
Yes.
But I think the real issue for me that probably existed and still maybe exists a little bit today is the issue of trust. Do the payers trust that the pharma companies come in really with the intention that's aligned? I think I mentioned in my first ecosystem sort of like the speech as well. But that I think is critical. And what pharma companies do when they come to speak to the regulators, to the payers, I think the tone you have, how you go about conducting a conversation, what you say, what you're willing to give up on your side as a company, I think is key to building that trust. Right now, because once you have trust and the sense that actually we are aligned in terms of what we're trying to achieve, which is ultimately deploying drugs in places which are cost effective, which are maybe the best clinical outcome that exists, or whichever modality that we are thinking of this particular drug, then you have a way of, in a way, closing the gap. Then I think the key thing that Ying mentioned, which is how do you measure that value? Are we measuring that value properly? Any attempt by the drug company to tell a government or a payer or insurance company that value is broader than what you see is going to be seen as posturing by the company to make you charge a higher price. Okay, so again, it goes back to the trust level, right? I mean, exactly what are we saying? And of course, if there is really that value that's being created, a third part of the conversation that we might need to then figure out is, then who pays, which is part of what you're trying to say right now. If indeed the guy now lives when he was supposed to die, because if he didn't undergo that treatment, he would have died, does he have a responsibility to pay a substantive part of that treatment? Now, he may not be able to pay upfront, but if indeed he does survive, does he pay maybe a percentage of his income over the period of his lifetime? Those are to me, the difficult conversations that we may need to have in order for us to actually really address the issue of can we really have outcome-based sort of like payments? Who should be paying? It's very inconvenient for the government to tell the people that because you survive, you must now pay. But maybe if there's a way for a pharma company to work out such a payment scheme, which makes it seem far more affordable, then all of a sudden people might say, okay, I will take this because I don't see it burdening my kids. I don't see it burdening my other family members. I think if I really survive, I can earn enough to pay it off, right? But if the government were to say that, everyone would say the government's heartless. You're making I pay. He's already sick. You're still making him, bet his life. So we have to understand that there is a range of different constraints that the different parties actually use. The right approach, the right way of assuring that everyone is actually committed to the outcome, right? Which is that actually that the patients live and have a good life, right? And of course, then the quality of life measures then become important as well. Then how do we do that? I mentioned this earlier on as well. Who measures is important, right? If the pharma company is the one measuring it, first of all, you might find it difficult. Second, of course, you also worry about whether the guy actually wants to pay up. If you measure his outcomes as being very positive, maybe he is then forced to pay up. He may then, fake his sort of outcomes. I mean, those are all real concerns, right? But who is the honest arbiter who can actually make that measurement, enforce that measurements, or enforce and maybe make sure there's no fraudulent entries or fake entries and so on, so that the system as a whole can trust that the outcomes are real and that there is a commitment to pay, and maybe there's someone underwriting even if there's someone reneging, right? And I think those are the pieces that right now don't exist, and of course compounded with the lack of trust that makes these conversations very difficult. One of the things that I've noticed when I speak to some of the pharma companies is that when I start talking about outcomes and I start talking about payments over the 10 years, the time horizons are a little bit too long sometimes for them to contemplate as well. 3 years, maybe 10 years. Are you sure? How do I account to that to my stakeholders? How do I account to my shareholders? And those are also concerns that we may need to have a way of addressing, which is why even as I started to try to talk to people, because I actually chair the Advanced Cell Therapy Research Institute in Singapore as well. So cell therapy is one of those places where really we need to figure out how to pay for this thing, or if not find a solution otherwise. I decided to talk to the banks as well, because I felt that in order for the pharma companies to accept a payment that is going to be phased out, they may need to have something that is an asset that they hold, that the bank underwrites, and they can use it to borrow some money in the meantime. And so I feel that there is actually a larger ecosystem that needs to be put in order for such a system to work. And once you have that in place, then you can begin to then say, okay, we may be able to find a solution somewhere between where the pharma takes some risk, the banks maybe take some risk, the insurance takes some risk, the government takes some share, and then the individual himself must also be able to take some share to find, I think, the solution for what we were trying to get to.
Absolutely, I think, and I echo the point about trust, especially because it's about having, that kind of a neutral, glue to bring it all together. Absolutely. I want to tap into one point, what you said about measurement, and I'm going to pass that next on to Joachim. I want to ask you, because measurement, and you mentioned earlier in your talk in the morning as well, it's about the data framework, it's about the diagnostics tests, sharing of the data. So on the diagnostics end, Joachim, we would like to get your point of view, because a lot of the treatment, pharma, medical device, surgery, treatment plans itself depends on the diagnostics, outcomes and measurements from that. So how do you see that, this integration of the diagnostic, tests and especially the new age digital metrics, for example, not just the typical clinical endpoints. How do you see the integration of that advancing or helping towards the larger cause of value-based healthcare?
I acknowledge the discussion around the value in that whole topic, but I think it's probably safe to say that the diagnostics will always be a measurement in exemplifying what value truly is. Diagnostics, clinical diagnostics, all forms of diagnostics that contribute to the value-based care play an important role in displaying and representing the patient as a unit, as a whole, as an individuum. And it can play this role, diagnostics can play this role if the data that's flowing into that data pool is standardized and is harmonized, and data pools or data generating systems are communicating with each other. So you were mentioning the digital health record in Singapore. So this is fairly straightforward. Diagnostics, especially when it's connected, helps measuring what outcome is really achieved by whatever methodology. And here I'm not talking about the workflow improvements that digital diagnostics can bring, higher quality, greater standardization of care, greater standardization of patient results, efficiencies in workflows in the laboratory, freeing up resources. So this is not part of this discussion. So it's really about integrating diagnostic data into a data pool that helps us running algorithms that display value. But here's the thing, and I don't know to what degree we all realize that in Singapore we're living in a bubble. We have electronic health record becoming reality to a large extent. It's not perfect. It's nowhere perfect. But at least we have an agreement in this smart nation that healthcare providers, that diagnostic institutes are combining data for the benefit of the patient. We're in a bubble because when we're looking outside Singapore in this geography, we are far away from that integration of diagnostic healthcare data, diagnostic data. When we just look across the border to Malaysia, when we look to Indonesia, when we look to the Philippines, there is a clear momentum in these countries to go towards that integrated data pool that represents a patient. But how far are we, how far are they on their journey really to combine data? And that is a challenge when you talk about value-based care today. To what degree can each country in our geography really measure based on diagnostic data? There are other measurements, no question about that, but here we're only talking about the diagnostic data.
And bringing on that measurement point, I think I value first, build the trust based on measurements based on what to measure. So I'm coming to you, Dr. Ronan Kelly, because clinical trials is your forte area. What digital biomarkers or endpoints over and above, say, classical endpoints perhaps in phase 1, phase 2 are kind of ready to take up the kind of take the forward step on value-based healthcare, and how do you build these endpoints with an RWE perspective perhaps?
Well, if we're talking about value-based healthcare, a surefire way of wasting money in healthcare is to give a drug to somebody in whom it's not going to work. I come from a clinical trials background. Another surefire way of wasting money is developing a drug that doesn't work. And a big part of my job is triaging drugs or assessing drugs to see which early phase drugs are more likely to work, which ones are less likely to work. So to go back a step, I spent a long part of my life working on drugs that were fantastic for treating diabetes in rats, but were no good at all in humans. Now, if all humans were the same, if all humans were identical, then if it worked in one human, it would work in all humans. But for better or for worse, that's not the case. So I start becoming interested in which humans, which people does this new drug work in? And to your point, getting data on that. So clinical trials are maybe a very long way from where they ought to be. So they are very driven by regulatory endpoints. The phrase phase 3 studies came up just recently. There is typically an endpoint specified by a regulator. It can be overall survival, progression-free survival in cancer. It can be glucose lowering in diabetes. It can be mortality after a heart attack. And phase 3 trials are typically designed to assess that one particular endpoint, because that's how a drug is registered and gets on the market. And for some things, it's relatively simple. Mortality after a heart attack, kind of black and white. But clinical trials, another waste of money is clinical trials are really very large. And there are several reasons for that. So a lot of endpoints are rather infrequent. Fortunately, mortality after a heart attack is increasingly infrequent. Other endpoints can be very variable. So some endpoints depend on patient-reported outcomes. Low back pain may be reported as a pain score. State of mind in depression is often rated as a scale of some kind. Dementia, Alzheimer's. Again, there's a lot of variability in the endpoints. There's one extreme example. I was exposed just recently to a study where 6-year-olds were being asked to score their quality of sleep over the last week. Now you can just imagine the variability in that particular endpoint. We'd like to do better on endpoints, better on measuring. Now, as a clinician, I also was brought up to believe in evidence-based medicine. And the evidence came from large-scale randomized clinical trials. That was, gold standard medical evidence. So I knew that the drug worked. I often could say how well it worked, on average. But in this particular patient, I had no idea if it was working. Now, for some drugs, maybe an antihypertensive, I can measure a blood pressure. And even then, we know that a blood pressure in a doctor's office is maybe very different than a blood pressure at home. So can we measure things in a better way? Can we measure things that relate to an individual patient? So we got to precision medicine. Now, precision medicine, oddly enough, often seemed to me to be to identify one specific marker that said, use the drug or don't use the drug. Well, that's not very precise. And we do very much better than that. So what are the valuable endpoints? How to measure value? These questions came up in the last 5 minutes. There are many things we can measure. So I work in the early phase of drug development. I bring drugs into human beings for the first time. I look at small numbers of human beings. Can we measure things better than just survived or didn't survive, or glucose lowers fasting glucose, or postprandial glucose, or average glucose? There are so many potential markers. So imagine a much more complex scenario. This is now the world we're working in. Let's take depression or Alzheimer's. Imagine that each patient has a smartphone which looks at them many times a day and looks at their face, looks at their eye movements and assesses those eye movements, looks at their facial characteristics and assesses those in a way that maybe I don't understand. Maybe that same smartphone assesses the timbre of their voice. It measures their stride length, their balance. Maybe it's linked to a ring on their finger that measures their heart rate, their blood pressure, the variability of that. And maybe that same ring measures their sleep quality. And then maybe in this smartphone or offline, there is an algorithm that integrates all this data. And we are now developing that kind of assessment in early clinical trials to see which patients and how well a particular new molecule should move forward. But obviously, the same technology could be applied post-commercialization and could be used to assess in this particular patient, is this drug working, whatever working means. Working depends on what we're assessing, and that's a separate question. But we could at least assess in individual people what effect the drug is having, rather than waiting for a much later endpoint. So I think there are much better measures that can be incorporated, but there's a huge amount of work to do to identify those measures, to validate those measures, and to work with regulators on acceptance of those measures.
Actually, I'm going to pick up on that word, acceptance of the measures. And I'm going to go, since you're at the upstream of the value chain, I'm going to go to Pri at the downstream end of the value chain, where it is you work closely with physicians on a day-to-day basis. So acceptance, one, regulators, policymakers, assuming that happens, and then we're moving from selling products to selling outcomes. Where do you see, or how this acceptance is going to look like for patients, clinicians, in surgeons even, in this sort of value-based healthcare space?
Sure. Just to anchor everyone together on what we do. So Boston Scientific is interventional medical device company. So what does that mean? I'll just share a little bit of a background. So if I'm a physician, if I'm a patient and I have a blocked coronary arteries, in the past, what would have been the only option is a bypass procedure. So what does a bypass procedure mean? Just hands raised. Anyone seen Grey's Anatomy? The show, right? Yeah, it's a lot of blood. They bring in scalpels, they open up the patient's thorax. It's a bloody affair, right? But actually, in reality, these days, that usually doesn't happen. What would happen is you would make a small incision close to where the groin is. The patient is under sedation. You send up some wires. You unblock, you basically do some imaging, you unblock the heart, and then, within a week, the patient goes up a flight of stairs, right? So those devices or those equipment that are used by physicians are what companies like Boston Scientific produce, okay? So it's a good business to be in because it's also one of those businesses in which you are able to show the value of what you're providing. Yeah, so I'll just link it back to your earlier question on the topic, is how can technology help drive some of that value? And the way we look at technology is, especially AI, is we look at tuck in AI in product and transformational AI within the company, right? So what do we mean by tuck in AI? So one of the products that we build is a pacemakers. Everyone knows what pacemakers are, right? And where AI adds value is because you have exposure to a lot more diagnostics using a pacemaker than you would have in your, say, your smartwatch or your phone. We're able to basically determine 45 days in advance for a patient who would have a cardiac event. So it's old school AI, but it has a lot of value because for the healthcare system, if you know 45 days in advance of a patient having a cardiac event, you can intervene, right? So in that scenario, showing value is more black and white, yeah? In the second area, just coming back to the example with regards to, unblocking the coronary vessels in the heart, just imagine a second, right? We can't really see what's going on, right? You're sending wires into the heart, but you might not necessarily know the nature of the block, how calcified it is, the lesion is, you just don't know. So we have imaging solutions. And what we're seeing, especially in this part of the world, is the exposure to physician education may not necessarily be as high as in Europe or in the US. So when we are educating physicians on using these diagnostics tools, it's actually quite a high burden for us. So I think we heard in panel one, leveraging AI to speed up some of the diagnosis. This is what we do as well. It's basically a guidance system called IVUS, intravascular ultrasound, in which we basically leverage AI to set up what the diagnosis should be, provide the recommendation to the physician, and the physician just takes it on from there. So by doing this, we're able to reduce time by about 62% on an average procedure. But what it does is, if you leverage guidance while you're doing the treatment of the patient, you're able to reduce adverse outcomes by as much as 50%. So it's one of those ways in which we do not have to go straight into an LLM-based solution to provide value to a patient and physicians. You could leverage, call it old school AI, but the value for a patient and to the physician and for the healthcare system is quite tremendous. So this is one area in which we are looking to be taking AI in those specific areas that we think can add value to the physician and to the patient.
Looks like the medical device sector measurement and sort of demonstration of value involves a total different, convention of assessment as compared to, like with pharma. It's a different confounding factors and so on. So now we've kind of gone through like, okay, where are we now and what's our, kind of stage? We have another maybe 10 to 15 minutes. So I'm going to do a quick poll with the audience. So just to make sure that they're listening and they're not sleeping after lunch. All right. So poll number 1, just a show of hands. How many of you in your organization, is there some form of outcome-based pricing, risk-sharing agreement in whatever kind of work that you do, be it pharma, medtech, startup working in the hospital with your partners, etc. First round of hands that you already have something like an outcome-based agreement in your setup. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and second round of hands is it's something that you're expecting to definitely have in place within the next 12 months. Okay, maybe 1 or 2 hands, not so many. And how many of you are saying that you're still pretty far away from it because of all the challenges that were just mentioned? How many hands go up for that? Okay, there's definitely a lot more hands for that last one. I think we can clearly see. So I think one of the follow-up questions to the audience very quickly is, What is probably your biggest blocker for outcomes deal? Just you can put up your hands as I read out the option. Is it the data in silos? Is that one of your biggest problems that you've faced? Any hands going up for that? Okay, is it the fact that there is a lot of operational workload on the clinicians and the health system? Is that one of the other challenge areas that you typically see? I see a few nods, but you can feel free to put your hand up so our panelists can have a look as well. Okay, and I think that kind of gives us an idea that it's not probably as mature in this part of the world, and there is a few, I would say, leading practitioners who have already kicked it off in this part of the world. So this brings me to the second part, and I think we wanted like a quick view of where would technology, now we are in the age of AI, you know, value-based healthcare has been there for a long time. I think some of these arguments are not so, we've kind of heard them before. What can technology offer you, or how can you deploy technology differently to perhaps bridge us closer? Maybe not in the immediate present tense, but perhaps in the near future. So I want to start with Dr. Yeoh. If you could deploy one, let's say, like you said earlier on, maybe Zühlke can jump in and help bring all of those data backbone together. A shameless plug-in, by the way, guys. Deploy that, for example. Let's say you had a magic wand that an AI would do whatever you wanted. So in Singapore, what would be your first steps, and where would you stand up outcome-based agreements or a risk-sharing-based agreements? Your 3 priorities or 3 metrics that you would measure, how would you stand that up?
So I don't know whether there's any very good place. I think one of the key things is probably in areas where you're clearly either having like no cure, or maybe a cure that may work. Like I said, the outcomes are very easy to measure. Then of course the duration of then survivability afterwards, very clearly the value is large, right? So where the value is large, even if there is some error, you can probably measure something that actually makes sense. But of course, the challenge is that many times the cost of those drugs are also quite high. So, but I guess in terms of measurement and the ability to measure, that's probably an area that we can kind of think of in terms of deployment. The other thing, of course, is you talk about agentic AI and stuff like that, right? Is there a place for us to do that? I mean, we have been talking about all the different possible ways of thinking about measures of better outcomes. What AI is very good at is actually taking all the jumble of information and then giving you some sort of statement. Now, would we trust that statement? I don't know. But maybe it's a good place to then start to say, okay, maybe the only way to really say, and maybe not to force yes, no, but maybe just to rank order, and then say, okay, this is all the information I have about the individual collected across multiple sources and so on and so forth. How would you rank order outcomes, in some sense, across the different people and so on, and just to get a sense of what might be the ways of thinking of the measurements and the kind of indicators that may actually work. So I wonder whether that's one way of then deploying the AI in a way that actually helps us to solve an issue that we are currently grappling with. Because I feel that in the end, the way that we think about value, right now, it's all quite siloed. Sometimes we may not even know where we should be measuring that value, right? So that's just one area that I thought maybe we could think about in terms of how we could deploy that in a way to help us to maybe help us to reimagine how else we could measure value. Maybe that's one. But the third thing I would then say is that in terms of the measurement of value, one of the things that I've been trying to get the system as a whole to try to build is actually the availability of data across multiple places. But what I do need is every company being willing to then put their data into that ecosystem somehow, right? And of course, then on the government side, maybe all the administrative data that we can have for the individuals as they sort of like live their lives is also somehow available. And that's when the agentic AI or some sort of AI can go in and trawl through the data to get a measure of some of these outcomes. And on that basis, maybe some benchmarks can then be determined. I think I like what Ronan said just now about this. gold standard one, then you're like, but the world is not so simple, and you have all this pristine design, and yes, completely supposedly unbiased, except that when it gets out into practice, you know that it's still biased. And then you start thinking, okay, so what are we really trying to achieve? But I think once you say that, let's go into real world evidence, the key is then the pharma must also recognize, I also cannot say, oh, this is not relevant, that's not relevant. Everything must then be relevant. Then the question is, how do we subject ourselves to that data and make sense of it? We may not be always precise, but hopefully we are mostly accurate in terms of the payments and maybe in terms of how well the drug worked. And maybe even to allow ourselves to say, okay, yes, maybe the guy survived 3 years, not 10 years. There is still some payment that will take place, right? And to just have a bit more grayness, which we would not have been able to contemplate previously, but today we have a much more digitalized health ecosystem, health data, much more diagnostic possibilities, much more sort of like, ability to monitor on an ongoing basis, that we have to imagine a new way of thinking about how we measure these outcomes. So I just feel that that's how we ought to be proceeding. Not necessarily I've offered a solution, but I am trying to set up the conditions that allow us to get there, which is companies must be willing to realize that their data is useless in their own company, but extremely useful when combined with everyone else's data, so that everyone can benefit from this.
Absolutely on brand with the ecosystem theme where everybody comes in together. So I absolutely love that. Ying, I'm coming to you with this. So if, again, you had a magic wand and potential challenges that you see, this magic wand could be an AI wand or whatever you wanted to do. What challenges would you see that the modern technology that we have could take us one step further to realizing the promise of value-based care, some outcomes-based solutions and so on?
So I think I agree with a lot that what is being said, right? Actually, when Ronan talked about we can now measure a lot of things, which is very true. That increases even more complexity, isn't it? But I think fundamentally, right, like I think AI, digitalization definitely are tools that enable us to really figure something out. And nowadays, I think in the age of digitalization and the availability of deep tech, it gives us an avenue of, if we want to sit down and find a solution, it does look like tech could potentially now be able to support us a little bit more. I mean, in the past, like, it's really a black box, right? Like, you're not going to spend millions collecting data, trying to sieve through those data. And now actually there is this possibility that, data that sits there, it's possible to actually integrate. It's possible to actually look broader. And I like how we are thinking about it. It's not just about healthcare outcome data. It's linked to productivity. It's linked to, health, social, environment. So there is much more bigger picture that you can actually see from the data itself. But what would really enable it is for us to now look at it more comprehensively and sit down and agree on what is our priority and what are actually the outcome that matters for us as a country, right? This is where it's beyond just in healthcare, or it's beyond just an individual, right? Like, we are in a state where we are really rapidly facing with aging healthcare. Workforce is going to be an issue. Things are becoming very much more expensive here. So there are certain challenges that I think as a country we can align to in terms of what is the priority. But at the same time, we also need to look at the people side of things. What are the key things that is important? I think for those things to enable, I think my magic wand is that how do we find the right people to sit on the table to align on this set? Then I'm sure actually we have that technology that can help us to do that. I mean, it may not be perfect, I agree, but I think in the larger scale of things, I don't think perfection is what we're looking for, right? It's the openness to then, agree that, 10, 20% variation, we can always come back and revisit it. But really having the right stakeholders in the room to make that first step forward, I think it's important. So I think that would be the magic wand that
you want. Okay, fantastic. I'm going to come to Dr. Ronan Kelly. Talking about collaboration, having everybody at the table together, having a little bit of skin in the game, if I hear you right, Young. So how would you say collaboration, because it all right at the upstream of developing evidence with these data, clinical studies, etc. Collaboration where would you see that? How would you, let's say you have the message, the audience here, startups to the hospital healthcare systems. How would you like to give them a message about collaboration?
Well, a couple of comments. So first of all, I think there's an absolute explosion of technology companies that allow us to measure more and more things. We now have the technology, I think, to analyze that data, which we could not do even, I think, 10 years ago. But secondly, I think I need two fairies with two magic wands. So if I take, yeah, I'm being greedy. So ideally, I would like to know what is of value to each individual patient. It's going to be different. No two patients, however similar they seem, are going to have the same perception of value. And annoyingly, even for one patient, it changes from day to day. The other fairy would control the system and say that the patient, the patient's family, the GP, the hospital physician, MOH, and Ministry of Finance would all have the same perception of value, because they will all be different as well. From my point of view, in developing drugs, I want to develop valuable drugs. I'd like to know what's valuable. Up to a point at the moment, or historically, what is valuable is what is set by regulators. But going forward, the world is changing. There needs to be a conversation with the health ecosystem, with patients, with patient societies, with very many people about what in each individual case, maybe each individual disease, is valuable. How do we rank, prioritize, value those particular outcomes? Is it longer survival? Is it less pain? Is it better sleep? Is it better sociability? I can't tell you, but we need input so that in developing drugs, we can assess whether they are likely to be valuable to the community if we are to develop them.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. And this kind of sounds in line with what you said in the morning was, so value could change if you stratify the patients correctly. What is invaluable in a larger population with stratification will help. So that's, again, in line with the precision medicine initiative. So that's perfect. I want to come to Pri, because I think I'll give you the magic wand as well. So if you want to have the magic wand, what would that look like? But I also wanted to understand, because I know a lot of the work that you do is also around training the physicians, training, for adoption of devices and so on. So when we move this conversation from products to outcomes, and typically, the commercial teams training the physicians on usage of products to outcome-based. So how would you envision that in the future? Maybe it's not a reality at the moment, but in the future, and with the magic wand, how would you, what would you wish for?
So I'll start with, I think one magic wand is okay. I think the thing that keeps me up at night a lot is maximizing existing value. And we have a lot of really good products. And the thing that keeps us up at night is we're not getting enough physicians trained on it. We're just not. And I'll just give you just a simple example. It's just, so I'm just highlighting the folks with prostates in the speakers panel here. By the time we reach 50, two of us have an issue with regard to enlarged prostates. By the time we turn 70, it's 100% of us. Okay, so we have a product which basically uses water steam to treat the patient, and it takes about 3 weeks to recover, retain sexual function. It's actually very safe. It takes about 15 minutes to do the procedure, and the issue that we have is we just can't get enough physicians trained. Just can't. Okay. So on Singles Day, 11/11, a couple of years ago, Charles and I, a gentleman there in panel 1, we were experimenting with using digital as a means to treat physicians remotely. So I'll just use this in this case. I was a physician in Adelaide in Australia, and I virtually hopped from one hospital, so 5 hospitals in Malaysia, which have a distance of 700 kilometers, over a period of 3 hours, to treat 5 physicians treating 11 patients. Now, in the past, something like this the way to think about it is $5 for every $1 worth of value. But in this case, we're able to reverse it. So $1 gives you $5 of value because you're able to do something in digital that physically you just can't do before. You know, folks in the audience, there's a lot of great product in the by the providers on the panel. Is there a way in which we could expand its reach in APAC? Because once you get out of the tier 1 cities, including Singapore, it basically goes down really, really hard from tier 2, tier 3 cities. And yes, we share the same zip code in APAC, in Singapore, but we are usually focused on APAC markets too.
Thanks, Priya. I really appreciate that. I'm going to come to Joachim last now question, but you don't get a magic wand, sorry. But instead you get a regulator point of view to say, like, okay, now enough of the magic, now come back to reality. Now we're selling outcomes, with all the interoperability, I think, which is the backbone that I think has just been, is everybody saying it in just a different way. There is the cybersecurity angle. I think that's the fundamental risk that comes with, okay, for all these magic ideas to come true, it has to interoperate the data across it. But there's the cybersecurity angle. So sorry, I'm not giving you the magic wand, because I want to hear from you on your, from your APAC Med viewpoint and your expertise there. What are the cybersecurity related elements, trends that everyone in the room needs to be aware of, especially when it's taking forward the data sharing together towards value-based healthcare?
Okay. Yeah, APAC Med has just published a white paper on the topic. So when you go to the APAC Med webpage, you pretty much find what I'm saying right now. So medical technology is producing roughly 30% of the data that is out there today. That's a huge amount. It's unbelievably big. And it obviously creates an opportunity for innovation with all that data, but at the same time, it makes us aware of risks associated with data. And there are two trends that we're seeing in the Asia-Pacific market today. So in market, I mean countries. Obviously, every country acts differently. That's one of the problems in Asia-Pacific. Not one country talks to the other country about their regulations. That's a little bit exaggerated, but it goes into that direction. But we see two trends in the context of the explosion of data and cybersecurity. Number one, we see a tendency for countries to localize data or to send out a demand for the localization of data. That is, in spirit, very nice, protection of data, protection of your citizens, protection of your citizens' health data. But obviously, that is creating a more costly health data ecosystem, because all of a sudden you cannot use cloud solutions, which are very well protected by now. And you don't get access to multi-country health data that you need, just on a very basic level, for example, to inform or to train an AI system that requires a very diverse population, especially in the field of healthcare. So then following that, in parallel or after that, there's a trend to increase cybersecurity rules over and over again. Singapore is no exception to this, all for good reasons. So these are trends that we see in the market right now that makes the work of connected healthcare, of interoperability within a country and between countries more difficult. The technology to secure data privacy, to secure patient health data is out there, but it's not widely used right now. Cloud-based systems are, I'm not saying they're bulletproof to cyber attacks, but cloud providers provide very, very resilient cloud infrastructure that is probably much better than any physical server that a hospital have in their server room. So we are proposing from an APAC perspective to look into cloud-based solutions as the first attempt of design, considering all the security. Privacy by design, privacy enhancing technologies, they are out there. They would allow the safe transfer of data between stakeholders in the ecosystem. So at the moment, as an industry association, we are seeing what's out there in the market, and we're trying to get in contact with the regulators to make them aware what they are doing from a vendor perspective, obviously very biased, but also reflecting what we see with our partners in the clinical field, what they need. So we're lobbying on our own behalf and on the behalf of our clients. But yeah, this is pretty much it. We need to work with cybersecurity. We have to acknowledge the cybersecurity needs that are out there in the market, but we have to address cybersecurity concerns in a practical, safe, and technology-focused way.
Thank you for that. I think that really sums up all of the conversation, that it is doable, the technology exists, and it's going to take us forward to that step.